It's a great honor to have Andrew Winston with us. He's the author of the book that you're going to read, The Big Pivot, that will guide you through assessing a company of your choice and also proposing how a company can do a big pivot. What is that big pivot? We'll have Andrew tell us a little bit what and where he came up with that framing from, and also how it fits within the conversation that we already started with statements like the Business Roundtable issued in 2019, Larry Fink in 2018 admonishing companies that they need to sort of readjust and pivot the purpose of their company, the governance of their companies, and basically adopt a different mindset, what I call a humanistic mindset, to really help people flourish on a planet towards creating a shared well-being. So Andrew, thank you very much for being here with us. And maybe you can just share a bit your background, where you're coming from, why you're sort of working in this field, and how you came up with these with suggestions on the big pivot, and your general sort of sense of where current leadership globally are challenged, where is challenged.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure always to speak with you and your class. I'm a fan of the humanistic management view. I think it's a critical part of what I call the big pivot. My background is just really quickly is in business. Originally, I worked for Boston Consulting Group in the early 90s when I came out of college, and then worked in media companies doing strategy, marketing, biz dev. I wasn't doing sustainability or environmental things. I didn't have training for that, but I had kind of a value check in 2000 or so, the end of the dot-com boom, and wanted to figure out a way to bring my kind of personal interest and passion about the world and how we use resources and kind of are we building a thriving world, and bring that to my business. So I went back to school and kind of merged environmental thinking with business, and then wrote books and been doing this now since kind of 03, 04 as I came out of grad school. So a number of years and working with multinationals on how they think about this. The Big Pivot is, my third book and is the most recent. It came out in 2014, but years later, it's still pretty relevant and it's still being bought and used in classes like yours, because I put out what I thought was a pretty aggressive view about how business should think about itself. And that the big pivot is fundamentally a shift from focusing on short-term profits first and foremost, and then maybe getting to some of the shared challenges we all have when the hurdle rate looks perfect or there's enough pressure from NGOs or whatever, and flipping that to say the purpose of business needs to be solving the world's biggest problems, and that's also giant markets, trillion-dollar markets, and solving those problems so that we build a thriving world for all, and then work back from there and say, how do we do that most profitably using markets and capitalism and the kind of tools of economics? And that's a fundamental flip. And that Business Roundtable statement in 2019 really is, in some sense, I guess, I hope, a beginning of a kind of public statement that moves away from shareholders only, which has been kind of the dominant economic model for 50 years. So the big pivot, fundamentally, in terms of what's driving CEOs, is kind of a series of mega trends. And that's where a lot of my work has been for a number of years, is on understanding these mega trends and helping companies and executives understand them as well. Now, the book lays out three really big ones, and those are still really the biggest, but I'll elaborate on those a bit. I spend time these days talking about 5 or 6, kind of really big issues. The climate, obviously, which year after year becomes clearer that it's a very deep and serious problem for humanity. And I'll just say that these megatrends, I think they are what concerns CEOs. It is part of what's driving them, but it's not the exact same agenda for CEOs. They have some other things that they have to worry about, which I'll get to. But the megatrends are fundamentally a changing climate and the devastation it is wreaking and the cost that it wreaks, and that is something business notices in their value chain, as you see, factories underwater or markets that are in disarray because there's been massive storms or droughts or floods. There's a real continuing pressure on natural resources. We have found smarter and smarter ways to get more resources out of the earth as humanity's grown to 7+ billion people, but it is getting harder and more expensive. And things like water, there really is just kind of a finite amount in every watershed. And so those are becoming constraints on business, and I think very serious ones. There's also, on the positive side, this mega trend of movement towards the clean economy that is moving so fast and has surprised, I think, the energy industry pretty dramatically. We are seeing solar, wind, and battery storage becoming the cheapest forms of energy around the world very quickly. And we will see, I think, almost all new energy put on the grid in the 2020s will be renewables. And the move towards electric vehicles as well, as batteries get cheaper and cheaper. So those are kind of the big kind of sweeping mega trends. There's also a change in the generational attitudes about business. Millennials and now Gen Z, as they enter the workforce, have a different view. Kind of, it's measurable, a different view about business and its focus on profit, in that it should be looking at more than just profit. I think that's part of, again, what drove CEOs to kind of make public statements, is they're listening to their employees and to their customers as well. And then there's, I think, a technology-driven level of transparency. And it's also something the younger generations are comfortable with and demand. We now expect to know everything about every product and service. Where did it come from? Who made it? Were they paid a living wage? What's the carbon footprint? What's the water footprint? On and on. And so all of this adds up to a very deep change, I think, in what's expected of business. And clearly you're seeing CEOs over years making more and more statements that they need to be thinking about society, that all of these pressures mean that they are not outside of society. They are part of it. They are a critical part of it. They're some of the biggest entities in the world. And they're feeling this pressure to help define their role in society. I think this is a really critical change that BRT statement is one element of, but there's many more statements being made by CEOs and companies. So those are the mega trends, but I will say that when you ask, what are CEOs concerned about, there is still, on top of all that, they still have the pressure from investors, and they are still concerned about short-term performance. As much as they're saying all this about long-term and the role of business in society, it's still a tension that we have not figured out a way out of. Investors are speaking more about long-term than they used to, at least the institutional investors. But the day-to-day trading, the day-to-day kind of market analysts, the regular Wall Street investors, they're not really caring about the long term. And so CEOs of public companies are facing this very tough dilemma of being concerned or even afraid of stepping out on long-term issues like climate and somehow seeming like they're not focusing on their profits. And that's why I think there's still this tension where they maybe still think of sustainability or corporate social responsibility as outside of profit, as something, X financial, rather than understanding it as the path to success and the path to profit. And I think as more and more companies get that understanding, that's in some sense what the big pivot really is, that they see it as the path to success and profit. And without managing people and planet, we don't have thriving business. And that's the fundamental idea behind the big pivot. So I think those are the big trends. Those are the big ones that are shaping business. And we can talk about kind of how they play out as, in what ways that you'd like to kind of explore with your class.
Right. So I think what you mentioned in the end is sort of what you also see in the book is the mindset shift, right? That Donella Meadows and others and sort of working on. This is, if you understand business this way, it's almost like a Copernican revolution. Yeah. It's like the profit is not the center anymore. It's important, but it's becoming a means to an end, and the end needs to be something bigger. And Larry Fink and other institutional investors are saying, yes, this is the purpose piece, which many CEOs aren't really able to grasp yet. Right. In many ways because of the ecosystem that you were mentioning of the financial short-term investors that are still sort of setting some of the tone. Now, in your work, you've been working with a number of global leaders. What's standing out for you with those that you've been working in? What are they focused on most? What are some of the ways that students here can learn from these leaders? We're going to, in that course later on, read a number of case studies. But you have a special insight in some of the thought processes of these leaders. And maybe you can share some of that so that our students who are going to take on the roles of CEOs in this class sort of get an understanding of what is that thinking? What does it look like?
Yeah, well, like I said, there is still a very big tension between what they believe their primary duty is, which is to manage the profitability and long-term investment prospects of the company. They don't focus on the long term as much as they should, or they think about sustainability as an investment. Even if it costs more upfront, as some things might, they'd see it as an investment in their future. I mean, look, from what I've seen, the really big companies, they're certainly aware of these mega trends, and many companies are playing in a product set that actually can help solve these problems. So there's a lot of upside to talking about climate change or trying to help solve it. They're understanding so much better now their footprint and their impacts on the world around their value chain, where they have risk, where there's potential reward. And I think, companies have been gathering data for many years about their footprint, and they have a much better sense of it now. And I think do see more and more innovation being led by sustainability as a path to growth. But again, this tension is still really tough, and there's no easy way out of it. And I encourage the students to kind of think about that. Like how do they talk about making this pivot in a way that shows that it is about value creation for the company? But let's be clear, there are sectors and businesses where a sustainable world is not compatible with their core business, right? You have fossil fuel companies. They have to sunset their core business if they have any hope of being a part of the future. That's a pretty difficult thing for public companies to do, but it has been done. I mean, we've talked about, and you'd like to hear some examples of companies. There's, the Danish company Ørsted that used to be Dong Energy. They were natural gas, oil, coal, and they about 10 years ago, they in about the mid 2000s, late 2000s, they started to switch their whole business, right? They started selling off their fossil fuel assets, and now they are the largest producer of offshore wind in the world. So they made the change. They said, the world's not heading towards more and more fossil fuels. We want to be part of the solution. We don't want to be contributing to the world's biggest challenge. And they made the shift. And Vattenfall's another, Northern European energy company that's done that. We're not seeing that from the super big majors. They're really still investing a ton of money in looking for fossil fuels. So there's a disconnect, very, very much so. But I think you're seeing some sectors really wake up to the systemic thinking. I think food and agriculture, enormous change going on. The big guys like General Mills and Kellogg's setting aggressive climate goals, setting targets, and putting out plans and tools for the farmers in their supply chain to manage their impacts and footprint. I mean, they're feeling climate change. They're seeing it, right, in the supply chain. So they're working on it systemically. And then there's the growth, in the late 2010s, the growth of alternative proteins is kind of astounding, right? There's Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger and these companies putting out alternatives to how we eat. And I think they're being taken seriously by people and by companies in a way that we had never seen before. So there's some really big shifts happening in certain sectors. Others, I think, are still in denial, about how big a change has to happen. And that's very difficult for leaders, to kind of get a handle on. So I think you'll see more and more the sectors kind of in the retail and food and ag value chain just changing their systems more and more. It's the really heavy industrial guys that are going to be more and more challenged. How do they operate in a way that's part of a thriving future? And that tension for a CEO is very difficult to manage.
So, Andrew, you also have the privilege of working with some of the forward-thinking, leading kind of companies and CEOs. For our students that are asked at the very end of this course to present a innovative solution, a product, a service, etc., what can you share with them in a way that they can look at, learn, in terms of making sustainability a driver for innovation?
It's a really good question. And I'd like to say there's a ton of companies we can point to where that's been the core of their thinking. I think, we're still in some ways at the beginning of seeing the social and environmental megatrends as a way to drive innovation. You see more and more companies setting goals on that now, saying from now on, all of our new product development, all of our innovation will take into account the SDGs. That's kind of a statement that you see companies making, that we want to innovate to help solve the biggest, 16, 17 categories of the SDGs. All of our new products, 3M has a target. All of our new products will have a sustainability dimension, and there's been increasing goals like that. Again, outside of the kind of pure plays like Tesla, alternative proteins, the people that are actually trying to change the system entirely, it's hard to point to a lot of the big guys where they've made sustainable innovation kind of the core. But as I was saying earlier, there's companies that just kind of naturally, their product lines play in this space and are part of the movement forward. So Ingersoll Rand is a company that I've worked for, and they're not super well known, but they actually are the biggest producer of heating and cooling systems in the U.S. and one of the biggest in the world. They make Trane, which is kind of the brand that people know. They don't always know the parent company. And so they have been working on, low global warming potential refrigerants for a while. And they have products now that have a global warming potential maybe of 1, kind of equivalent to CO2, versus hundreds or thousands like past HFCs or CFCs. This is a highly technical thing, but this means as we start to see more and more legislation and push to reduce emissions, their greener, lower carbon products are part of the growth solution, because frankly, it's a bad loop. But as the world gets hotter, people are around the world, and as they get wealthier, they want air conditioning. And if we don't actually solve like the refrigerants issue with air conditioning, everything else is kind of moot. It's that big a problem. It's something like 5% of emissions now is just, cooling. And so there's companies like that where their products, are right in the middle of it. Ingersoll Rand also makes refrigerated trucks for transporting food. And so they can play a role in the food waste issue, which has a huge climate and water and resource use, issue. So there's companies where their products are part of the solution set, even if they're also part of the problem. So, Siemens and building technologies, building management software and technologies for bringing down the footprint of buildings. There's so many that can play in that arena. So there are companies that already argue they are part of the solution set. Siemens has, a green portfolio of building management tools, hardware and software, and they say it's about half their revenue. So without calling themselves a green company, they're part of that. Then there's the kind of old standards in sustainability, like the Patagonias and Interface, and the kind of the medium-sized guys who have made doing what they do, apparel or flooring, carpeting, in a completely sustainable way. They've made that their quest, right, from the get-go, and made innovation around that just part of everything they do. But the stories, from the big guys of really shifting their business around sustainable innovation are still, I think, fairly sparse. We're kind of at the beginning of that, of realizing that is the path forward. And so you see the goals being set, but it's kind of like we're waiting to see who's really going to take the lead and kind of run with it. But I think the tools are there now. We have, again, much better data about the footprint of every product, about the choices we're making and how it affects the supply chain and the customer use. And so you're seeing innovation with more data and understanding behind it. And also a push for innovation in materials in particular. The push in the late 2010s against plastic, single-use plastics, global movement of laws and regulations against single-use plastic. You're seeing in the chemical and packaging industry a lot of attention to what are the alternatives. Is aluminum and other metals, the right solution? Paper instead of plastics? What kind of plastics can we create that are made from recycled or waste material? And then how much can we close the loop at the end of the cycle of that product? So we're seeing, I think, innovation around certain materials as well, just, driven by, again, that kind of social change in expectations, the generational change, and just concern about the scale of impact of the amount of plastic in the ocean and the kind of climate change impact of that whole industry.
Great. You have pointed to one company particularly that's large and that is leading the pack, so to speak, Unilever, and you write about them, and you've been on their board or advisory board for some time. What do you think from that experience can you share that worked well? What didn't work so well? That student can then maybe explore a little bit more.
Yeah. So I mean, look, Unilever is such an interesting story because in the sustainability world, people paying attention to this, they're the clear winner, right? There's surveys regularly of people, kind of sustainability minded people. And Unilever, I think, has now been ranked one, for most of their kind of 2010s that they made sustainability, where they first made sustainability their core issue. In 09, 10, they put out their sustainable living plan. And it said, we're going to cut our footprint in half while doubling sales. I mean, they went right from the beginning to say, we're going to grow through this, which was, again, kind of a very forward-looking, way ahead of most companies. And they achieved a tremendous amount. I mean, they cut their footprint, their carbon footprint. They went to a heavy amount of renewables, a ton of work in their supply chain and sourcing, like Hellmann's mayonnaise is all cage-free eggs. There's, sustainable soy work. There's, they've been working on the livelihoods of the farmers in their supply chain for tons of different food products, and their packaging work has been aggressive. I think the most interesting thing, though, about them, there's a couple things, and this is something that the students should think about from the CEO's perspective. First, in dealing with the investors, right? So since they were so early on this, on making it the core of their business, it was way before the Larry Fink letters of 2016, 17, 18. And they were saying to their investors, we're not going to talk to you as much quarterly. And so what the CEO at the time, Paul Pullman, did was basically start to shift the investor base to longer thinking investors. So they moved it where something like 70% of their investors basically hadn't sold the stock during the 2010s. That's a much longer holding period than most stocks. They got longer term thinkers in, and in a way pushed out the investors that were thinking very short term. They took a lot of heat, really, over the 2010s from some parts of the investor community and made it seem like they took their eye off the ball on profits. And they had a very close to a hostile takeover from a private equity run, that owns Kraft. And I think it would have been a disaster. They fought it off, and actually their stock kind of kept rising from there, making a hostile takeover even harder. But they were under tremendous pressure for somehow not paying attention to the bottom line. Again, even though they outperformed the FTSE in Europe and outperformed their peers throughout that whole decade, so I think the changing of investors and trying to avoid that pressure was one really important aspect to think about. But the other thing that's gotten very little attention from the people kind of paying attention to them is something they've kept, I think, secret in a way, or quieter because it's a competitive advantage, which is they became, and still are, I think, the kind of go-to for buying fast-growing, smaller and mid-sized sustainable brands, companies that were founded entirely around our product is to serve people, or it's made entirely from recycled materials. So personal care products, food. They bought up a bunch of companies in the 100, 200, 300 million sales range, so not tiny, but ready to explode. And many of those companies, the CEO said, we were not for sale. We only wanted to sell to Unilever. This is an incredible competitive advantage that I've wanted to write about, and they kind of haven't wanted me to for a number of years, because I think it's a competitive advantage and it's worked for them. And you've seen other big companies create their own venture funds like General Mills in the food realm. But this M&A activity from Unilever, I think, is a huge advantage that doesn't get much attention. And then there's a third one, which is the advantage in hiring. Like Patagonia, Unilever gets so many applicants per opening because people want to work there. And they get the best, they hold the best. They're one of the most in-demand employers in the world. And they, by their own admission, make boring stuff. They make, shampoo and, and soup. So I think the level of advantage they've created is still very unusual. And others are kind of catching on to that, but they kind of keep pushing the envelope and finding a deeper and deeper way to talk about these issues.
And Unilever is an interesting case to watch also, students, because the CEO transition just occurred. And Andrew, do you have any take on that? is that a legacy now? Is that has it become a DNA? Is there a mind shift, or was this much connected to a level 4 type of leader?
Yeah, well, that's always the risk, right? Is Pullman was so unusual, and he really was just a leader. For years, people have asked, what's different about Unilever? And the answer was, it's not easy to replicate. It's just he was a leader, right? He just saw this as clearly the best way to operate and said, I'm not going to care what the pressure is. And so there was a transition. He left the company in early 2019. They started transitioning to the new CEO, Alan Jope, in early 2018. And what my understanding is that that the new leadership actually not only kind of continued it, but felt like they could go further. Just thought it was so core to the brand. And I think this is something that will play out over years to see, is that true? Have they kept up the focus? My understanding, and I'm kind of researching and kind of digging into this a little bit to understand what's happening there now, is that the new leadership said, what Pullman did was amazing, but we can go even further. We can make this even more core to the brand. And I'm excited to see kind of how that plays out, whether that's true. So right now, culturally, it was, in that level 4, level 5 leader thing. And Pullman was kind of a classic level 5 leader and was, in the Jim Collins way, I think a clock builder, not a time teller, right? I think he did build a structure there over years where the buy-in is just throughout the company. They've taken the top 200-300 people through a kind of leadership development, purpose-driven process to decide what their individual purpose is in business and in their life. And they're rolling that out to thousands and thousands of employees so that everybody kind of takes a purpose-driven view of it. So I'm excited to see what they can continue to do. I mean, look, they're still a consumption-based company, and there's always that tension of, they sell more stuff, and is that compatible? But I think if anybody's going to figure it out, it's them.
Great. And you were mentioning the takeover attempt for Unilever. And you see that in the space, maybe the sustainability space, Unilever is sort of the revered example. Do you see that sort of like with the Business Roundtable statement becoming more so the case? Where are people going to look, and what's your personal take? And you've written about that as a response to when the Business Roundtable statement was issued. Yeah. What's your take on that, and where's the beef, so to speak?
Yeah, look, I think, as I said, it's a good step. On the surface, it's a big deal because, again, since basically 1970 and the famous essay from Milton Friedman, the economist, saying the entire responsibility of business is profit, basically. There's been 50 years, fundamentally 50 years of neoliberal economic thinking, that the model is that the purpose of a country is basically, GDP, the stock market, value, and the purpose of a company is just their stock price and their profit to shareholders. And so the statement saying that's not totally true, we're thinking of other stakeholders, is a big change, and they say that. But I think, what I wrote about this was that there are signatories to that statement where if they really meant it, like I said, like the fossil fuel companies, they'd have to sunset their business. If they're really taking care of stakeholders, the community, and the world we live in, their business is not compatible with that future. So I think from what I've seen so far, talking to a few companies where CEOs have signed it, I'm not sure they, frankly, fully understand what they've committed to. And you saw a reaction from the B Corp community right after the statement came out, because what they said was basically, we're all B Corps. I don't think most CEOs realize that's what they said, right? Because that's, in a way, they defined it the same way B Corps do, which is we're not just pleasing shareholders. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen about how serious they are. I think, heavy critics of corporations have asked a lot of questions since that statement about, okay, so what policies are you going to stop doing? Things like what legal tax avoidance schemes that you use now will you stop doing because they're unethical, right? What things are you going to stop doing that you just know aren't right, even though it's technically legal? And I don't see a lot of announcements around that so far. That said, what's happened in kind of recent years on the social side of the kind of sustainability agenda with companies has been kind of remarkable. you've seen companies step out very, very much in front, speaking truth to power, telling, governors or even presidents, we don't agree with you on this, around things like LGBT rights, diversity and inclusion, guns in the US, companies saying we're going to voluntarily take guns off our shelves, like Dick's Sporting Goods, Walmart and a bunch of other kind of supermarket chains taking ammo off, taking handguns off. I've been surprised actually how much that has changed and how much you're seeing companies put a social agenda out front and just feel like it's the right thing to do. You can be cynical and say, well, they just think it will help their business, but then that just proves the megatrends. That proves that they believe customers want them to do this, their employees want them to do this. And in a way, I don't really care why, right? If they're doing the right thing because that's what people want, great. And so I've been surprised how forward they've been on the social side. So I really look at that, as students take a look at companies and say, what are their companies that they're looking at been willing to talk about publicly? And some of it is kind of surprising, right? Like you wouldn't think they'd get involved in trans rights, and yet companies are, and so that gives me a lot of hope that companies are seeing their role more broadly and kind of recognizing just how big a part of society they are. So I think that's the part that I see a lot of progress on.
Wow. And do you think that's a typical American phenomenon at this point, or is this something that also resonates globally? Let's say China, in Brazil, or other European countries. Do you have any assessment on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, look, you're not going to see a lot of Chinese companies step out on, human rights, right? I mean, they're not, because they are mostly, government-owned entities or government-run entities or funded. So it is obviously different in different regions, and you have kind of different social dynamics going on. I've been seeing a lot more interest in sustainable business around the world in recent years, far more as regions that I think felt like they were developing, they could kind of sit it out for a while, are realizing that the megatrends are real, it's hitting them too, and that again, the demands of their own employees, of their customers, which could be multinationals, could come from the US, are shifting. And so they are asking more questions about how do we think about our business, how do we think about sustainability, not as just some cost center, but as a way to drive business. So I'm seeing an evolution of that around the world. But again, there are obviously different social issues, right? I mean, there's so many countries dealing with immigrant populations now and how to bring that into their culture and are struggling with it, and companies are struggling with that as well. You have places like Japan and others where there's an aging population, and so there's kind of workforce issues. And so you start to see pressure for more inclusion, say in the Middle East, more inclusion of women in the workforce, because you kind of need a more diverse workforce. So there are different issues, but I think multinationals just seem more comfortable speaking out on these issues than ever before.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for that assessment. One final comment that I like to ask is, like, what advice would you give to your younger self 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when you were going through a master's program of some sort? And what advice would you sort of give the students now that are exploring their career options in a way? Like, what sort of some insight that you've gained that you wish?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess if I went back to my younger self when I was in grad school for environmental management and my MBA in the late 90s, and then environmental management in 02, 03, I guess I'd kind of warn myself that all of this might take longer than I'd expect, or that the movement, what was becoming so clear to me in my reading that, sustainability is what business has to do, was going to take a long time. I can't remember the exact quote. There's something around the fact that all of us, we tend to overestimate what will change in the short run and underestimate what will change in the long run. And that's, I think, a really fundamental thing. And it's true. I think it's applied often, that kind of statement, to tech, right? Like as tech doubles speed every year, you think it's going to be radical. But it might take 5 or 10 years till it's like something's 1,000 times faster, right? There was, in the 90s, we're going to have streaming video. And then 2 years later, it didn't happen. But 15 years later, Netflix is using most of the web each night, right? And is one of the fastest growing companies in the world. So we tend to overestimate, I think, how fast there's going to be a change. So there's a business roundtable statement, right? Okay, companies are going to totally get it now. They're going to change their focus. They're going to make the big pivot. And I think it's not going to happen that way. And in a way that many of us have been talking about this and knew this 5 or 10 years ago, and we had hoped companies would start to get it quicker, but you hit these tipping points, right? You hit them socially on, say, LGBT rights, where when the tipping point happens, how companies and all of us deal with those issues changes really fast, legally, in business, what's expected by society. But it changes really fast because there was 30 or 40 years of work leading up to it, right? In the moment, it seems really fast. And I think we're in that with climate, business and climate. They're just getting it. They're not denying it anymore. And so things are going to start to move quicker, and we're hitting tipping points on the clean economy. But if students are looking at, wow, I really want the world to operate differently, you got to realize that there's going to be time, and you got to kind of start putting in that time and building to the place where when those tipping points happen, everybody's ready to roll, right? The tools are there, the kind of mood is there, the buyers are there, the customers are ready, the investors are kind of ready, but it's going to happen in these leaps. And that, I think, would have been good for me to know, so I didn't maybe get as frustrated by the pace of change, and just realize that, some of these things are kind of exponential, and they can seem really slow on the curve and then shoot up.
Wonderful. Any specific advice to the cohorts right now that maybe they are on the exponential thing? Because I think looking back just several years, the investor statement by Larry Fink and the business roundtable statement, those are already seemingly like this is a shift, at least in the rhetoric.
Yeah. So my advice always to students is don't underestimate your voice and your power. I haven't found that millennials or Gen Z are shy about speaking to management. So I'd say keep that up. Go into job interviews and ask questions about their sustainability. Ask about the BRT. Say, what does that mean for the company? And when you get into business, and I'd say, a general advice is that not everyone leaving school, leaving these kinds of degrees, has to go into a clean tech company or go into, a fully focused green company. Go into banking, go into consulting, go into big companies, but bring this knowledge and this sensibility and ask the questions and force the issue internally. I've seen this work at companies where basically it's the younger, newer employees who will ask the questions and will come up to the CEO, come up to the CFO. I've been in meetings where I've seen this happen, even recently, where a CFO says basically all that matters is shareholder value. And then the person who raises their hand in the audience in that meeting is the 27-year-old new hire, not the person that's been there 30 years, who says, but I think there's a triple bottom line. What do you mean? I've seen that exact conversation. So don't be shy, and think about what your voice means, even interviewing for jobs, the questions you ask, and think about the role you can play in traditional roles in companies, even if you're not the sustainability person, by being a sustainability person in whatever role you have. I think that's the critical thing. We need everybody's job to change. So you don't have to go into one specific path to do that.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This is great.
Thank you.
Students, you're going to get more from Andrew when reading the book. So, and then, we're going to report back to you.
I'd love to see it.
Those reports are and how much innovation was sparked. So thank you again.